Welcome to Book Nibbles. Big Ideas, Small Bites. The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg is one of those rare books that takes a simple, almost invisible part of everyday life, our routines, the automatic patterns that guide so much of what we do without conscious thought, and peels back the layers to reveal just how powerful, structured, and malleable those habits actually are. Duhigg's work is both investigative journalism and behavioral science storytelling, weaving together tales of individuals, companies, and even social movements to show that habits are not destiny, but rather a system of cues, routines, and rewards that can be understood, reshaped, and harnessed for success. His narrative begins by focusing on the life of a woman who completely transformed her circumstances, moves into the way corporations exploit habit loops to sell products, explores the science of habit formation in the brain, and eventually broadens to institutions and societies, all the while returning to the central idea that habits follow predictable rules. If we understand these rules, we can change them. One of the first powerful stories Duhigg presents is that of a woman named Lisa Allen. By her mid-30s, Lisa's life was a mess. She was overweight, a smoker, heavily in debt, and had struggled with relationships and jobs. But a few years later, researchers studying her brain scans and health records found a completely different person. Lisa had quit smoking, lost 60 pounds, run a marathon, gotten a steady job, and even bought a house. What intrigued the scientists wasn't just the extent of her transformation, but how it had all started with one simple change: she decided to quit smoking. That single keystone habit had rippled outward into the rest of her life. Once she gained control over one destructive behavior, she began restructuring how she ate, how she exercised, how she managed her finances, and even how she approached relationships. Her story illustrated the underlying principle that habits are not just small quirks of behavior, they are the building blocks of who we are, and shifting one can cascade into others. Duhigg explains that habits operate through what he calls the habit loop. Every habit, whether brushing your teeth, biting your nails, or checking your phone, follows a three-part cycle. There is a cue, which triggers the behavior, then the routine, which is the behavior itself, and finally the reward, which is the payoff your brain associates with the action. The brain's craving for that reward is what cements the habit loop into something automatic. In Lisa's case, the cue was the craving for relief that cigarettes used to provide, the routine had been smoking, and the reward was the sense of calm or control. By recognizing the loop and inserting a new routine, she was able to rewire her brain's response. Neuroscientists studying her brain found that the basal ganglia, the part that governs habit formation, had essentially stored her routines like files in a cabinet, waiting to be triggered. These loops never fully disappear, which is why relapses happen, but they can be reshaped. This framework becomes even clearer when Duhigg shares the story of Eugene Pauly, a man whose memory was destroyed by a viral infection. He could not remember new facts, could not tell you the names of people he had just met, and could not form new explicit memories. Yet astonishingly, he could find his way around his neighborhood, remember how to prepare breakfast, and even go on long walks that ended up at his house. When scientists observed him, they discovered that even though Eugene could not consciously describe where he was going, his habits were intact. His basal ganglia were guiding him through familiar routines even when his conscious brain could not. This revealed something profound. Habits do not require conscious memory. They exist in a deeper, more primal part of the brain, which means they persist even when higher cognition fails. Habits, once ingrained, become automatic programs. The implications of this are enormous, and companies have long recognized the power of habits, sometimes more intuitively than scientifically. Duhigg turns to Procter & Gamble's story of Febreze, the now iconic air freshener. When the product was first launched, it flopped. Consumers didn't think they needed it, even though it eliminated odors. Market researchers dug deeper and realized that people had become so accustomed to the smells of their homes, whether cigarette smoke or pet odors, that they didn't even notice them. The marketing team realized they had been trying to sell the product as a solution to a problem most people couldn't perceive. What turned things around was the recognition that habits could be built around rewards. Instead of advertising Febreze as odor elimination, they promoted it as a finishing touch to cleaning. Commercials showed women spritzing Febreze at the end of tidying up a room, smiling at the fresh scent that became a cue for "I'm done cleaning." The routine was spraying, and the reward was the satisfying sensory marker of completion. Sales exploded. By inserting Febreze into a habit loop, The company turned failure into a multi-billion-dollar success. The same principle played out in other industries. Take toothpaste. In the early 20th century, very few Americans brushed their teeth daily. Dental health was poor, and the military considered it a national crisis during World War I. Claude Hopkins, a famous advertising pioneer, was asked to sell Pepsodent toothpaste. He crafted ads that emphasized the film that naturally forms on teeth and promised that brushing with Pepsodent would remove it, leaving a clean, tingling feeling. What Hopkins inadvertently tapped into was a perfect habit loop. The cue was the film on your teeth, the routine was brushing, and the reward was the tingling freshness. The sensation of minty cleanliness wasn't even necessary for dental health, but it created a craving. Within a decade, brushing teeth went from uncommon to nearly universal. Hopkins proved how cues and rewards could transform behavior at scale. Duhigg doesn't just stop at consumer habits, he digs into organizational habits too. One of the most compelling corporate stories is about Paul O'Neill, who became CEO of Alcoa in 1987. When he took over, investors expected talk of profits and efficiency, but instead O'Neill declared that his number one priority was worker safety. Analysts were baffled. What did safety have to do with earnings? But O'Neill understood keystone habits. By focusing obsessively on safety, he forced the company to rethink processes, communication, and accountability. To make Alcoa safe, managers had to log accidents immediately, empower workers to halt production if needed, and design more efficient systems. These changes spilled into other areas, improving productivity and morale. Over O'Neill's tenure, injuries dropped dramatically, and profits soared to record highs. Safety was the keystone habit that transformed the company. O'Neill's lesson was that focusing on the right habit can reshape an entire organization. Habits also influence willpower, which Duhigg highlights as one of the most important keystone habits for individuals. He shares the story of a young Starbucks employee who lost his temper with a rude customer. Starbucks, like many service companies, relies on employees to handle stressful encounters gracefully. To help workers build willpower, Starbucks didn't just tell them to be nice. They trained them in routines. Employees learned specific responses to difficult situations, rehearsed them, and practiced until they became second nature. For example, when a customer yelled, instead of reacting emotionally, workers were trained to follow the latte method: listen, acknowledge, take action, thank, and explain. This created a habit loop that turned stressful moments into predictable routines, reinforcing willpower. Duhigg connects this to research showing that willpower functions like a muscle. It can be strengthened through practice, but also fatigued with overuse. Developing habits that conserve willpower, by turning behaviors into automatic routines, frees up mental energy for more difficult tasks. But if habits can be so powerful, how exactly do people change them? Duhigg emphasizes that habits never truly disappear, they can only be replaced. The key is to keep the same cue and reward, but change the routine. He illustrates this through Alcoholics Anonymous. AA meetings are not primarily about telling people to stop drinking. They provide a new routine, attending meetings, sharing stories, relying on a sponsor, while keeping the same cues, stress, loneliness, craving, and the same reward, relief, social comfort, escape. What AA adds is belief, the belief that change is possible, often reinforced through faith or community support. Without belief, people tend to relapse during stressful times. With belief, new habits stick. This idea is echoed in research on soldiers, smokers, and dieters. Belief is a critical ingredient for lasting transformation. Habits also shape societies. Duhigg dives into the Montgomery bus boycott, where Rosa Parks' arrest for refusing to give up her seat sparked a movement. The reason her act of defiance spread wasn't simply that it was unjust. Others had been arrested before her, but because of the social networks and habits surrounding her. Parks was deeply embedded in multiple communities, church groups, volunteer circles, and neighborhood organizations. When she was arrested, these networks mobilized out of habit, spreading the word, organizing carpools, and turning individual outrage into collective action. Duhigg argues that social movements follow the same habit loop principles. Strong ties spark participation, weak ties spread it, and leadership creates new habits that sustain it. Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders provided a new routine for responding to injustice: nonviolent protest, marches, and rallies. The cues were daily indignities of segregation, the reward was dignity and hope, and the new routines became ingrained until they reshaped society. Even in sports, habits determine outcomes. Duhigg shares the story of Tony Dungy, the NFL coach who turned around the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and later led the Indianapolis Colts to a Super Bowl. Dungy's strategy wasn't to overwhelm players with complex playbooks. Instead, he drilled them to react automatically. He focused on teaching them to recognize simple cues, like how an opposing player placed his feet, and to respond with rehearsed routines. By practicing until these routines became habits, his team could react faster than opponents. The payoff was consistent performance under pressure. Dungy proved that success comes from embedding the right habits so deeply that they emerge instinctively in the heat of competition. Throughout the book, Duhigg returns to the central idea that habits are not destiny. They are patterns waiting to be recognized and reshaped. But to change them, we must first identify the cues and rewards driving them. He shares an experiment from his own life. He developed a habit of buying a cookie every afternoon at the New York Times cafeteria. By dissecting the habit loop, he realized the cue was a sense of boredom or restlessness at 3 p.m. The routine was going to buy a cookie, and the reward wasn't the sugar but rather the socializing with colleagues he encountered. Once he recognized this, he replaced the routine. He started walking to a friend's desk instead of the cafeteria. The craving for social interaction was satisfied without the cookie, and the habit changed. His personal example illustrates how anyone can apply the habit loop to their own lives with some experimentation. By the end of The Power of Habit, what becomes clear is that habits are at the core of nearly everything we do, personally, professionally, and socially. They dictate how we eat, exercise, spend money, respond to stress, and interact with others. They shape corporate cultures and national movements. But they are not unchangeable. With awareness, intention, and belief, we can reprogram them. Keystone habits like willpower, exercise, or organizational safety can unlock larger transformations. Companies can design products and workplaces by understanding how cues and rewards operate. Individuals can break destructive cycles by replacing routines while keeping cues and rewards intact. And communities can mobilize when habits of protest and solidarity become ingrained. Duhigg's book leaves readers with both caution and hope. The caution is that habits can control us if we remain unaware. Advertisers, corporations, and even governments exploit them. But the hope is that once we understand the science, we can seize control, shape new patterns, and design better lives. Habits are powerful because they operate automatically, but that same automatic power can be harnessed for good. The stories of Lisa Allen, Eugene Pauly, Paul O'Neill, Rosa Parks, Tony Dungy, and countless others serve as reminders that change is possible, not through willpower alone, but through the deliberate design of new habit loops. The power of habit is the power of transformation, if only we learn how to use it. And that's it. The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. Thanks for listening to Book Nibbles. If you enjoyed this bite-sized book, don't forget to subscribe for more quick, insightful summaries. See you in the next nibble.